Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impact these are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. Our first guest brings over 20 years experience in tech and startup world. He currently serves as CEO of Sorse Technology. Please welcome Howard Lee. Thanks for being
Heather.
here.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. And back joining me today is our in-house expert. He leads our research team here at New Frontier Data. Please welcome Chief Knowledge Officer, Mr. John Kagia.
Delighted to be back, Heather. Thank you.
Well, always great to have you. Well, before we get started, Howard, would you mind giving our listeners a quick rundown of Sorse Technology, what you all are working on for those that may not be familiar?
Sure. Sorse Technology is a group of more than 50 employees, of which 35 people are research scientists and process engineers. And we make the use of cannabis safer through the use of emulsions and emulsion technology. So we can make things safer, perfect dosing, better tasting cannabis products, whether it's edibles, beverages, even inhalation products. And that's what we do.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, we have a great show as we continue our 2020 coverage of 2020 election coverage. And we're going to be, since we have Howard with us today, we're going to be getting some insights on the future of the cannabis industry and what that may look like as far as how innovation like infused beverages will be affecting the industry. So we have lots to cover. We'll dive right in. NPR.org reported a PBR spiked seltzer with THC hit shelves aiming at the canna-curious. So Howard, who are the canna-curious and what's driving them to infuse beverages?
Sure. So the canna-curious is probably 95% of the population who doesn't use cannabis on a regular basis, right? And they're curious. They want to know what the high feels like. They probably haven't been high in the last 10 to 15 years, and they want to use cannabis on a social basis. And so the canna-curious are the low dose, frequent drink or edible user, right? So when I say frequent, they may want to take 2 doses of 5 milligrams in a 4-hour period rather than just one large dose that many people do today.
So it's a way to kind of ease them in to the product.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a gateway. I think it's a replacement for alcohol. It's a replacement for smoking. It's a replacement for the inhalation of cannabis, right? So a lot of people just don't want to smoke anything or even vape anything. And that's this replacement. That's the canna-curious with infused beverages. And that's what this one beverage that this seltzer is trying to attack. One of our customers, Cannon Bottle, is just raised some money that was publicly announced yesterday. And they're in the low dose market as well. And they're doing incredibly well.
Amazing. John, we do so much consumer behavior and monitoring all that. What do you think is driving people to the infused beverages?
So I think there's a convergence of things, and just worth noting to the company that Howard was referencing, one of the people who they raised money from was Gwyneth Paltrow, who has given the scale of her influence in social and kind of health matters. I think will play a role in kind of like Martha Stewart did. And getting people to really think differently about it, and particularly the way she positioned why she thinks a product like can be presents such a rich opportunity. Her view on the opportunity for cannabis and cannabis-derived products to present an entirely new kind of gateway into wellness, I think is a really interesting lens for some of the things that are triggering people to think differently about the opportunity that cannabis represents. So to your question, why people think about looking at beverages specifically. So there's a lot of people who are kind of casually observing what's happening with legalization or what's happening with legal cannabis access and just how much cannabis has pervaded our social society, but who have reservations about smoking. Even though smoking is the way most people who began consuming cannabis over the past 50 years, that's generally been their first point of intersection with cannabis. One of the reasons why smoking has remained so dominant is because the other types of products generally have not offered a quality of experience that can rival that you would get with combustion. And I think we're finally at the stage in terms of the innovation and the science in the marketplace that has made it possible for infused products in particular to offer really, really elegant experiences, both in terms of their effect. So, being able to cut down dramatically the 45 minutes to 90 minutes that it used to take for an ingested cannabis product to take effect. In some cases, getting that down to 5, 10, 15 minutes, which really makes for a very different type of experience. But also the combination of much more rapid onset with really elegant kind of taste and flavor profiles. So the sorts of beverages that you would want to drink, even if they weren't infused. And one of the things that we've been hearing about Can in particular, which is aimed squarely at that alcohol substitution market, is people love the flavor profile of it. That seems to be one of the consistent themes in that consumer feedback. And so for those who may be reluctant to smoke, but are interested in experiencing cannabis, trying to see what all of this is about, these types of products hit that sweet spot of being delicious when ingested, fast acting and effective when ingested, and consistent between experiences, so that you always know what you're going to get.
Yeah, we saw, I feel like it was right at the beginning of the pandemic with the lockdowns, we saw a surge in edibles and stuff like that. And I think it came down to people being at home, and whether they have young kids or middle-aged kids, they don't want to be smoking in front of their kids, right? So they'll go for maybe a gummy bear to take the edge off instead of alcohol or something else. But I feel like the East Coast hasn't seen as much of a influx in these infused beverages yet. So hopefully that will be coming a little more normal over here. So Howard, I would love to get your take on what do you expect from like major industries like alcohol or pharmaceuticals getting involved in this space in the future?
So yeah, so to come back to your other, you just made a comment about a lot of the products aren't available yet on the East Coast. And I'm an old man now in the cannabis business, and it'll take another year or so before the infrastructure is in place to have high quality, great tasting edibles and beverages in the East Coast. I know for a fact many of our team members are actually on the East Coast helping licensees get up to speed, and I think you'll see them in early next year with some of the nice products that are out there available here in Washington State and Oregon and California. So you'll see a lot of that growth in Colorado. You'll see all those products start migrating out to the East Coast.
Yeah, I have a lot of mom friends that ask me about it, and I'm like, I don't think you know what I do in the industry. Like, when can we get that? I'm like, I'm not a retailer. I don't think you know what I do.
Yeah, so
but sorry.
No, it's fascinating how the expectation of people's desires now are actually filling our licensees are actually trying to fill the demand now, and they're actually looking toward demand, and they're not just looking at leaf product anymore, which I think is a big deal. You asked a question about alcohol and pharmaceutical companies looking at this space or being how they're reacting to this space. So prior to the pandemic, or not the pandemic, COVID. I think what was happening is, and here's a great way of describing it. We used to test ourselves of how popular cannabis products were or are in Washington State, at least, and in California. And when it became legal 3 to 4 years ago, we actually hosted a party, and we had legal cannabis beverages available. We were one of the first to help with those beverages. And then we had hard liquor, we had wine, we had beer. And in the first couple instances, the first year, hard liquor and wine were consumed at a pretty heavy rate. People tried the cannabis products. And then the second year, literally all the cannabis products were gone in the first hour and a half. And then nobody touched the hard liquor. And I think that was an indication that, hey, cannabis could replace a lot of hard liquor, could replace a lot of things that are happening here. Last year, the same thing happened. And you're going to see, I think, really good cannabis products in the beverage side replace the hard liquor side. It's just better tasting, less of a hangover or no hangover, and potentially even better dosing. And I think you'll just see a lot of that happening as things go forward. And from what our indications and meetings with alcohol companies, they're definitely worried about it. Now, with COVID, you can kind of see that all the liquor companies, all the cannabis companies, and everybody is doing well because everyone's stuck at home and they're drinking, and they're both imbibing both products right now. But once COVID's over, it'll be interesting to see how hard liquor may come off the peak or not, right? So it'll be interesting. Pharmaceutical companies, they're dealing with the legalization of CBD as a nutraceutical or as a novel food product in Europe, or just as a food additive, right? Because they're kind of stuck in this never land. They approved GW Pharma's product as a pharma product, but it's really just CBD oil, right? And so how they allow that into the normal population, it's going to probably be by state. New York is coming out with some, or just came out with some documentation that says eating cannabis and providing not cannabis, but CBD products is legal, starting at the end of January. And that's a big deal for a lot of the CBD manufacturers, right? And we'll see how those markets open up as we go, almost again, state by state for CBD as well.
John, what are you seeing as far as, do you think there's going to be a big disruption with alcohol and pharmaceutical companies coming in?
I think potentially, echoing Howard's point, it's really interesting watching this initial but really compelling transition that we see in some of these case studies of cannabis over alcohol. And why I think the alcohol companies should be really worried about not what's going to happen in the next 5 years, but what's going to happen over the next 25 years is part of the way we think about the evolution of the alcohol drinker. So generally, most alcohol consumers globally, depending on where you are and the rules in your market, you start drinking between the age of 16 and 21. And at that point, with an unrefined palate, you'll generally be drinking either very low quality alcohol because you can't afford higher quality alcohol, or you'll be consuming kind of really sweet things like apple cider, I
think it was Zima back in my day.
The Zimas of the world. Terrible things. Or woodpecker cider in the UK, which is really popular with that early set. And then as you develop that palate, as you learn how to drink, then you transition to, in many cases, either beers and with more robust flavor profiles, and you develop that palate. You start building a palate for wines. And then you ultimately graduate and start to integrate spirits. And so it takes a bit of maturation. Very few people start drinking, Glenlivet as their first drink. It takes years of a palate maturation to become a Scotch drinker, a bourbon drinker, a tequila or a refined vodka drinker. And so if younger consumers are coming up in an environment now where alcohol and cannabis are both legal, and cannabis by virtually every health metric and increasingly across social metrics is viewed more favorably, then the amount of time they're spending building that alcohol palate that will make them a Glenlivet drinker 20 years down the line, they're not going to develop. And it becomes very unlikely that as they mature, that they're ever going to get to a point where now they're willing to try and experiment with these spirits that they've never had any exposure to and become deeply invested in those brands. And so the disruption here is not going to be on I don't think it's the disruption necessarily that's concerning here is about the one lesser beer over the weekend being consumed. It is the generational loss of spending amongst alcohol drinkers who don't develop the palates that are required to become buyers of these much more premium priced value-added products that people start consuming more intensely as a large proportion of their alcohol consumption as they mature, as they get into their late 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so I think thinking about this generational loss of spending is part of the concerns that the alcohol companies certainly should be paying attention to. And I think that may be part of the reason why you're seeing these alcohol companies paying much closer attention to opportunities that they might allow them to play in cannabis as well.
Right. Well, that'll be interesting to see what happens. Well, I know New Frontier Data and Sorse actually put out a report recently about, concept to commercialization and taking your infused beverage to the market. So I'd love to, maybe John, I'll start with you. Just can you touch on some of the challenges that we had broken down, as we did it together as a group, but that when you're producing or marketing an infused product that we touched on in the report.
Right. So and we were
Like, where do I
delighted.
begin?
We were delighted to get a chance to work with Sorse on this project, and it was really interesting to get kind of this deep lens into what it takes to go from almost that kitchen table ideation process to actually getting a product onto retail shelves. And there's a few kind of standout challenges that we observed through that process. So one is defining your customer. In the early days of particularly the CBD environment, we sell a lot of products that were trying to be all things to all men and women. There's this idea, if you build it, they will come. But when you end up with store shelves that have 50 different variants of CBD water, the question becomes, who is your customer? Who are you trying to target? And so the first challenge is understanding who your customer is, so that you're building a product that's effectively aligned with that consumer segment, and that allows you to build kind of competitive positioning, particularly against these more generically branded products. And revisiting Canna as an example, I think they're one company that has done a really effective job at aiming at that almost brunch drinking, youthful adult set, and the brand seems to be really resonating with that group. Another challenge is kind of figuring out what your product formulation is going to be. Sorse is, I think, a great example of an infusion partner who ensures that even as you're thinking about what the rest of your formulation is going to be, having a partner who can ensure that the product, once infused with cannabinoids, is offering the dosing and experience that is intended for your target consumer. Third is marketing. With all of the constraints around marketing and brand building in cannabis, if you aren't able to promote your products conventionally on the Facebooks and Google-like platforms, thinking creatively about how do you leverage everything from word of mouth, which is a really major driver of consumer awareness of cannabis and cannabinoid products, as well as also these cannabis-specific platforms that allow you to engage with cannabis consumers. Thinking creatively about and how do you most effectively reach your consumers. And then maybe one overarching one is the regulations. Despite how, or maybe because of legalization continuing to sweep across the country, needing to understand, what are the regulations in the specific markets that you're targeting and staying on top of them. This continues to be a dynamic environment. As Howard was saying at the beginning of this, just the developments in Europe with CBD. New York has just announced that it's made some concessions on how CBD can be marketed. Means that you've really got to be paying close attention to how the products you're going to be developing are regulated, to ensure that you don't run afoul of the law or end up having to accrue massive expenditures rebuilding or redesigning your products because the rules have changed around you. So lots of different issues or considerations at play. But Howard, I'd love to hear your perspective on what you think continue to be the big...
I want to know, Howard, what did he leave out? What did he miss?
I don't think he left out much. I think the interesting dynamic, so let's think about regulations, right? So, some regulations require that you can't be over a dose, right? So if you say that this is a 20 milligram drink in the THC space, it can't be over that. And if it's over, you could invalidate the entire batch. So, and some are, you can't be under that dose, right? In the CBD space, if you're under, you could get, it's problematic. So just the whole producing products is going to be a challenge combined with the regulation, right? So you have to understand both sides of the story. The other thing that's really interesting is as scale starts happening, people are starting to produce hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units a day, a week now. And QA and quality control and all of those things of producing a product are coming into play that a lot of licensees are not used to, right? And those are really big factors. There's also technical challenge that we won't go into, but like scalping and bitterness and all those kind of craziness that happens because of preservative packets or those things. And I feel for every single person who's trying to get into the market, or every person who's in the market doing this. And of course, the pitch is we do make things a lot easier with the use of Sorse emulsion. But it is very, very difficult today to be in each state if you're a THC company and trying to produce a quality product that is consistent across each state. They have a lot of factors, the distillate that they use, the emulsion that we would provide, and the flavor packets that happen. So it's very difficult. But having said that, we're seeing a lot of people succeed, and we're helping them. And it's really, really rewarding to see that happen.
Just a question on dosing specifically, Howard. What sort of trend are you seeing in terms of what is becoming the average dose size in the infused beverage space? Are you seeing some normalization starting to happen there?
No, it's actually becoming dispersed. You're going to laugh. There's high dose, almost tincture-like drinks that are happening with 100 milligrams in 8 to 6 ounces, if you can believe it. It's one of the more popular sizes now. Down to canned drink, which is 2.5 to 5 milligrams, right? So it's almost bimodal. It's kind of like someone's getting, and tagline could be get high cheap, to I want to have I'll be willing to pay for a normal beer type beverage, right? So it's very dispersed. I will say though that the amount of beverages as a percent of the market is scaling very quickly right now. It's in Washington State, I think our licensee is growing 15% month over month right now. And I think the beverages are really starting to take off. So it's just a matter of time. So it'll be interesting. I bet you in about 2 or 3 years from now, it'll be 35% of the market, 30 to 35% of the market, I think, of use will be in that space. But it is very bimodal right now, very low dose and very high dose.
All right, well, let's move on because I want to get some a take on some of the election stuff, Howard. So ABC3340.com reported election could stoke U.S. marijuana market, sway Congress. So Howard, in your opinion, I know that in this recent Forbes article, you were discussing the delays in New York's legislation, and you touched on the downside of vertical integration. And I wanted to speak to you. I know this article came out a little bit before, but I think it really touches to the election and what's going on. Can you just speak to a little bit more about why you think that's not the ideal path?
Yeah. So just to make sure people know what vertical integration is, it means that you're the grower, you're the processor, you're the manufacturer, and you're the retailer. And I think that's just such a bad idea. And the reason why I think it's a bad idea is it freezes out everybody who doesn't have an enormous amount of capital. So you need an enormous amount of capital to be the grower, manufacturer, licensee, and retailer, right? You just need an enormous amount of capital. So product innovation won't happen in the vertical market size. You could see that in Florida. Having been in a few stores in Florida, the beverages, quite frankly, suck. And so, because they can't spend all the R&D that a company like we can, or our licensees can, to develop a great tasting product and make sure it's functionally safe. How can a vertically integrated company in Florida actually be also a great bottler, right? It's hard to do all of these things. And the other thing about it is it's hard to also grow quickly as if you're a vertically integrated company. So you have to grow, and that's your only supply. You have to have your retail stores, so that's your only retail stores, and it's just very difficult. In Washington State, it wasn't vertically integrated. In fact, it was exposed to be completely separate, and you could see it explode from the first dollar in retail sales to almost $1 billion in revenue was less than 18 months. You can't do that when you're vertically integrated. So how's that for being very against vertical integration?
Well, it seems common sense that it should just be hard to be everything to everyone and be good. I mean, it's trying to be good at everything instead of just being focused on one specific thing you're specialized in. John, what's your take on that?
So we actually have, I think, a good study in contrast when you look at the Canadian model versus the US model. So the US model is, broadly speaking, the antithesis of vertical integration. And part of that is just by if you look at the state level markets where you're forced to do everything at a state level, which means that you have a lot of different companies in all of these different markets trying to innovate, trying to find their place in the market, trying to compete, versus in Canada, where you had national level firms raising billions of dollars to become, global empires. I think one of the outcomes of this distinction is that you've had a lot more product innovation happening in the US than you've had in Canada. And it's an analog of what Howard was talking about, the Florida model, just on a national basis in Canada, where they built so much so quick, so they had to build so much capacity so quickly that real question about whether they were doing it well in any of the areas in which they were involved, particularly with when they started talking about expanding globally, taking over capacity in Latin America and Africa, et cetera. This idea of trying to be all things across the supply chain meant that in an environment which is so primed for innovation, having thousands of basement tinkerers rather than 10 warehouses where you've got people who are working in highly constrained, highly structured environments. This environment in the US, which has been really primed for innovation, yes, it's meant that you've had a lot of people who have not been able to pull through, but it's also meant, I think, that you've had this kind of competitive level continue to build this knowledge diffusion in terms of what excellence looks like in the market. And I think because of that, the product innovation ecosystem in the US has been much richer than what you've seen in places like Canada. So I realize that we don't often take hard stances against one policy formulation over another. But in terms of stifling innovation, I agree with Howard entirely. I think the more diffuse the market is, the more opportunity it presents for stakeholders to get a foothold in the market, one, but also two, I think it creates, it accelerates the pace of innovation because you have a lot of different people trying different things rather than having a small subset channeling the funds toward major set projects and playing it safe.
Well, speaking of, I feel like we've all been talking about the slow creeping to federal legalization. And as we're watching the election unfold and have each ballots initiatives happening, is there an upside, Howard, in your opinion, of kind of this piecemeal legislation on the state level rather than full federal?
Yeah, so let's think about this. I actually am, if you asked me a year ago, would federal legalization happen? I would have said, oh, no, not for at the earliest 5 years, maybe 10 or 15 years. And the horizon was so far out. Today, I would say to you that federal legalization could happen in less than 3 years. And it's obvious because the pandemic has put strains on everyone's tax coffers. They just need to tax more things to generate more tax revenue. And cannabis is one of those things. So I honestly think that federal legalization could really happen much sooner than we might imagine. Having said that, I think it will be very difficult for small operators to succeed once federal legalization happens. Yes, the people who have licenses will be able to have a buttress, but the big players will come in. They'll come in hard with huge amounts of capital, and it will be a dogfight, right? For those people who have nice brand names now, and how they survive will be very interesting. I mean, I'm sure they're hoping to get acquired, and many of them will. But it will be, once federal legalization happens, the steamroller, of big alcohol will come in, the steamroller of big pharma will come in, CPG companies will come in, and it will be a dogfight for entrepreneurs to succeed in the cannabis space or even the CBD space, right? So I do think the state piecemeal work, so I'm coming back to your question, is right now with states being legal one by one in piecemeal form actually allows very nimble operators to, even though I know they hate it, it keeps people on their toes. It costs more money, but it allows smaller operators to work in this kind of what one would consider a gray federal environment, right? So it's actually a good thing right now for the small guys. And I know it sounds funny that we have market capitalizations of companies in the hundreds of millions. That's small potatoes compared to the big billion-dollar behemoths guys that could come in once it's really legal.
Yeah, I mean, with the amount of small businesses that are closing, I'm sure that that's on people's mind to keep them alive and moving. And it's funny because you say because of the pandemic, it's caused this need for taxing and people to have something to tax. But also, I feel like just the lockdowns and deeming cannabis, dispensaries essential has really legitimized the whole industry, right? And as far as people considering federal legislation, John, what's your take on that? Do you think that it's kind of a better thing for the industry, maybe, to be doing it state by state?
Well, so a couple of things. One, I think it is that kind of convergence, the acute need for financial revenues that is leading a lot of historically oppositional politicians to take a second look, particularly given how well cannabis has done during the pandemic. But also socially, I just feel like there's been a very different kind of lens put on cannabis these past few months that I think has changed the attitudes of a lot of people. I've been struck by some of the conversations that I've been having with folks in the US and Europe and in Africa that have literally done a 180 just during the course of the pandemic based on some of their exposure to some of the stories that they've been hearing. So I think that's helping accelerate this engine that was already moving. I think it's helped accelerate the shift in attitudes. Is federal legalization going to be a good thing? It's going to be seismically disruptive depending on how it is done. So there's a couple of models which we could be facing. One is one which allows kind of true federal commerce. So things like interstate commerce now become possible. Some of the rules that have precluded large companies from wanting to manage or deal with the risk associated with cannabis get lifted and they come racing in. However, given that, for example, the states which have had operators invest really intensively in building capacity, I think there's going to end up being something resembling protectionism. So at least initial efforts to keep, to ensure that the folks who've really kind of invested tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions, to build capacity from being overtaken by new entrants. I think you may end up seeing some protectionism that allows the larger existing market operators to compete at least for a little while before they completely get steamrolled. But to Howard's point, the reality remains that post-legalization, it becomes much, much more difficult for the small players, particularly the smaller or mid-sized players who are either inefficient and so who are not producing in a highly operationally optimized way, or who are undifferentiated, so who are offering quote unquote very generic types of products to the market. I think those are the two classes of operators who are going to find it very, very difficult to compete just in this upcoming market, let alone in a post-legalization, post-federal legalization environment where the stakes are going to be much, much higher, and the imperative to be hyper efficient with extremely well-defined kind of product strategies, I think are going to go up dramatically.
Amazing. Well, it's only a week away, so we got a lot to keep our eye on. Well, before we say goodbye, any final thoughts for our listeners, Howard and John?
Yeah, no. Well, hey, go vote, right? Everyone should go vote. As we spoke.
Yes, sir.
Podcast. I honestly think this is still with all the problems that the pandemic is causing, this is actually kind of the golden age of cannabis, right? I think we're just getting into the bright light of legalization. I think more than 40% of the population, I think there's 4 states up, 3 major states up for recreational legalization, Arizona, New Jersey. And I say 3 states because I'm also thinking New York is going to go legal because Cuomo said it's going to go legal, and I think he wants tax revenue. That's not on the ballot. But I think that it's just starting to reach the golden age where you're going to see major revenue, good profits. Once some normalization comes to the taxing, the IRS understanding that this is a real business and more expenses can be deducted and whatnot. I think all of those things are going to create this very, very interesting period for the next 3 to 5 years of just amazing growth, amazing innovation. And, we're going to see a lot more people getting their edibles legally and safely, right? So it's going to be a really fun 2 to 5 years, I think, in this run. It's not even close to being over yet.
Yep. And for anybody coming into the market that's intimidated, call Sorse. They will help you. They'll help you
We
through
will.
it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for your time today.
Of course. John, any final thoughts?
Definitely echo what Howard has just said. Go vote, please go vote. And if there's no other reason if you're a stakeholder in cannabis, to vote, understand that we just did a consumer survey with folks who were potential cannabis consumers, so folks who had never consumed before, but said they would be open to consuming in the future. And 50% of them said that when we asked what would make you consume in the future, 50% of them said cannabis becoming legal in my state. So just, that's just one illustration of why the transition to legal regulated markets presents such phenomenal opportunity. And if we're talking about the addition of places like Arizona, New York, New Jersey, in 2022, Florida, we're going to be bringing online some really consequential markets, consequential because of their populations, consequential because of their social and cultural influence in kind of the American zeitgeist, the global cultural influencers. And because of that, I think the next few weeks, as we figure out what our legislative environment is going to look like, will be absolutely critical, because they will lay the foundation for what the next few years could look like for the cannabis industry. Huge potential opportunities lie ahead. And while it is going to be impossible to put the genie back in the bottle, the speed at which this transition happens, I think, is going to be significantly influenced by the outcome of this election.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your time, and thank you to our listeners for joining us at CannaWeek. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast, and to keep up to date on all 2020 election cannabis coverage, visit newfrontierdata.com/2020. I'm your host, Heather Wickline, and I will see you next time.